Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining today. It's a pleasure to share a little bit about the evolution of ESG and how that's starting to really integrate itself into compliance and to risk management, and also share what Dun& Bradstreet is doing to contribute to this space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the general landscape and regulations, and then get into how does one start to manage those elements and put it into practice. So there may be a varying experience here with ESG, which stands for Environmental Social Governance Metrics, although I'm sure some of you are very familiar with them. And I think it's worth mentioning some of the history behind the emergence of these metrics, because they are relatively new and they're just starting to enter the beginning, one could say, of a maturity cycle where they're becoming standardized, widely used, and enforced. This slide gives you a by no means conclusive timeline, but an indicative timeline of how the values behind ESG metrics started to emerge, as well as some main focusing events that really prompted their use and the importance of measuring these types of metrics. This propelling force has often been driven by investors who are interested in putting their money where their values are, so to speak, and also activists who were disenchanted or frustrated with some of corporate business practices that have happened historically. So as you can see, it goes pretty far back to when investors didn't want to invest in products or services they did not agree with morally. And then predominantly starting in the 80s, but very much continuing since then, the 90s, 2000s, and definitely recently, we have a number of events that have occurred. The ozone was detected, the Exxon Valdez spill, the Nike sweatshop labor, the apartheid, and then more recently, a slew of pretty intense climate impacts. In the US here, we had a very devastating storm last year. It happened in Texas and ruined all of the piping because of the surprising low temperatures. And there's been many more since then. Much more to name. But then also there's been a lot of efforts around creating and codifying these types of standards, CDP, the SASB, UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, TCFD, and more recently SFDR, EU, and the European Banking Authority, starting to really crystallize how these metrics need to be considered alongside traditional financial ones. And so, investors and activists have very much propelled the popularity and the use of ESG, but now we are starting to see regulation catch up. And this is very important and very interesting in terms of a practice perspective, which I'm sure many of you are. And ESG is a broad category. So again, this is by no means a conclusive map, but you can see a number of ESG related regulations globally, ranging from privacy, environmental laws, climate disclosure, and so on. And notably, we have the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act coming online next year. That's really looking at ESG disclosure from supply chain. So you're starting to see that happen as well. And then in the US too, we're starting to, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, starting to get into beyond just a company's four walls where one might have the most control, and dipping into tier one direct suppliers and beyond. It's worth mentioning a couple of the regulations that are coming online in case you're curious, and in case this impacts your day-to-day. Focused here predominantly on the EU and the US, although there's many happening globally. Um, President Biden has previously issued an order calling for more transparency of and resilience of the U.S. supply chains, given the pandemic, now exemplified by the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and so on, but really recognizing the importance of supply chains in supporting companies within the U.S. territory and beyond. Some sectors are focusing on this, particularly in New York, the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. And then, of course, beyond, ESG as a general suite of metrics, there's a big focus on human rights. Forced labor, child labor, human rights abuses have always been part of the landscape, unfortunately, and it may be increasing now as well. And so there's a big focus to tamper that and get control of that as well, like the EU directive on mandatory human rights, environmental and good governance due diligence. And then there's another proposal here too, related to corporate disclosure of these things. So very interesting to see some of these regulations come online. Now, there's a lot to disclose. There's a lot to keep track of. But what we have found in some of our studies is that, and research, is that many companies don't really know how to keep track of this and don't know what data is available, nor how to use that data in an integrated fashion to their general risk management process. So this chart here is just showing some of the main effects that happen when organizations are not able to manage ESG data. And you can see there's quite a lot of risk here: increased operational risk, increased financial risk, damage to reputation, even loss of revenue, loss of employees, and so on. And then the numbers to the right are just telling you that it's a minority of companies who really are able to use this data well and even have the internal ESG data management practices to enable that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. A little more about why businesses are focusing ESG on their supply chain. There's many that come intuitively, but really it's quite critical today. The COVID-19 pandemic really elucidated how important and interconnected our supply chains are, and how a simple emergency or intervention could really disrupt global economic flows and access to key and essential materials and products. And we're seeing that exacerbated today also by the Ukraine-Russia conflict, obviously, as well as climate events and just general resource and labor shortages. And our supply chains need to be more adaptable, but in addition, there's many important components beyond just quality, time to market, and costs that are pretty important, such as integrating ESG and impact like carbon emissions, for example. The world is warming quite considerably, causing pretty intense and maybe one day catastrophic climate impacts. And part of our prerogative is to decrease those greenhouse gas emissions. And a big emitter is supply chain, since that's so many companies operating, sometimes heavy industries. And part of this too is not just risk management and adhering to regulations and making sure your revenue comes in because you have the right products and materials, but consumers are also that emanating that values-driven component that started with investors and activists, where they want to choose brands that are sourcing responsibly, that have a lower footprint, and these choices also come sometimes with a premium, a willingness to pay more. And the final driver here is reputational risk. So the relationship between reputational risk and financial decrease is not always cut and dry, but it's never a good thing. And here you have a number of examples of companies who've gotten in trouble, let's say, for going against ESG regulations, for not adhering to them, or trying to skirt the line in terms of what's required. And we do see progressively more enforcement of ESG related regulation. Most notably, there's been a number of lawsuits criticizing the use of greenwashing by asset managers or other ESG investor funds that did not fully use ESG metrics in funds that were advertised as sustainable, green, or ESG related, and so on. And of course, disclosure regulations are increasing too. And although this opens up companies to more scrutiny, the lack of disclosure also invites scrutiny and can become a reputational risk as well. So lots of things are changing in this landscape. It's a very important area. Many say, ESG is new, but it's not going away, and it will only become more mature, more required, more complex, and more resonant as our world continues to change. But there is a challenge in terms of managing this data. There tends to be a lack of transparency, visibility, and traceability. For example, we found in a KPMG report that only 13% of companies have complete visibility in their end-to-end supply chain. I would question even that number is high. Many companies have no idea what's happening throughout their value chain, contractors, subcontractors, and so on. So it's very difficult to really quantify the impact, much less change it. There's also a lack of ESG data quality and credibility. So traditionally, ESG data came from self-reported disclosure, or that from annual reports, sustainability reports, maybe company websites or news. Not necessarily the most reliable source of information, if very detailed and specific, and also limited to companies that had the resources or the need to disclose, namely public or large companies. And because of this voluntary nature of disclosure, data is varied, it's non-standard, and there's quite a data wrangling component to try to get that all aligned. And in addition, there's a lack of data collection and analysis systems to fill in those gaps and to make it more standard. Here from the World Economic Forum, studies showed just 9% of companies are actively using software that supports ESG data collection. And while that number will undoubtedly rise, it's still a very small amount, especially when companies are expected to be tracking this, adhering to regulations, and are potentially facing compliance issues if they're not able to do so. So I'll talk a little bit more about a solution that Dun & Bradstreet has provided to address some of these elements. And of course, we're by no means the only one out there, and there's many other elements to consider, but it will give you an idea of how one could go about this from a practice point of view. So we definitely focused on the supply chain component for a number of reasons. Dun & Bradstreet has a very wide global coverage of companies. It's about 450 million companies globally, many of which are private entities and suppliers. So already we have a large body of data on these companies that allow supplier due diligence. Also, the relationship of these entities between each other based on transactional and spend history. So that's something that we also collect and gives us a sense of what those relationships are like, as well as who's doing business with whom to do a supply chain risk mapping. And then with our solutions, it's important to have frequent monitoring and engagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, to aggregate everything in a summary view to inform measurement and reporting on an ongoing basis. So a way to think about integrating ESG into your due diligence processes, whether these are related to onboarding suppliers or customers or simply new regions that you're expanding to as a company, whatever may be your focus. Generally, you can think about integrating ESG into some of these traditional business practices. Anytime you onboard a new business partner or maybe a company you're investing in, there's an opportunity to include ESG criteria in that onboarding contract. So you're already starting to collect that information and see that. With RFP and awarding, there's an opportunity to also ask for information to make sure those who are ultimately selected, but also submitting to your RFP, have ESG credentials and can share them with you. You can make ESG metrics a condition for contracting, maybe making disclosure a requirement of that, maybe some key metrics, maybe your standard set of metrics, but this will help add to your universe of data that helps inform your decision making. And then also you can use it as a decision criteria. Do I want to choose this supplier or this product and service, or this one that maybe has a lower footprint, a lower human capital risk component, or what have you. And so there you can start to insert it into your selection process. And finally, risk management is an ongoing type of process and something that you would want frequent and updated data to inform how you're evaluating risk for whatever entities you're looking at. And that can be done through technologically, maybe an integrated API, simply getting updated data files, or through some type of user interface that you log on to, upload your portfolio, and view metrics on an ongoing basis. So, there's many ways you could get this information. At Dun & Bradstreet, I mentioned, this coverage of many companies. For ESG specifically, our coverage is around 34 million today. And we're rapidly expanding that. Right now we cover, I believe it's almost 30 geographies. We're adding another 20 in the next month, and then another 20 by the end of this year, for a total of 70 country coverage. So a proportion of that 455 million overall, but definitely a sizable chunk of companies, especially when you think about the traditional coverage of ESG, which tends to be rather small, somewhere around the 100,000. So anyway, that data cloud can enable user interface and software platforms like our Dun & Bradstreet Risk Analytics. Here you can, I'll give you some snapshots, but you can upload portfolio, view different views, not only ESG, but different types of supplier, financial, diversity, and delinquency risks. And that API can sometimes be the easiest solution to easily integrate into your existing data systems. You can call whatever data points you need, or call a large chunk of rows or data points that you're interested in. And with the DUNS number, which is a unique identifier for companies, everything is easily appended in an organized fashion. So that can sometimes be very difficult. I have a company name, but I don't know who owns it. I don't know if this is a branch, headquarter, a global parent, domestic parent. The DUNS number helps enable that hierarchy and organizational structure for you, which is very helpful. And then for those who maybe are not ready to embark on APIs and different technology, simply getting a batch file through CSV, FTP, or other type of file transfer is also an option. So I mentioned the D&B Risk Analytics, and here's just a quick GIF, really, or GIF, depending on how you like to pronounce it, of what that interface looks like. And you can see there's a number of different types of metrics. The ESG here is at the bottom. And this is a nice view where you can go on and see a diversity of metrics and tracking mechanisms and so on to help inform how your portfolio is doing. ESG specifically, here's a view of looking at unique suppliers to the left, and then their ESG information to the right. And this isn't a full view, but just showing you how you can granularly look at each individual one. And then to the right, not shown, but included is many more metrics, including 31 ESG topics that give you insight on what data is available and how they're performing. These high-level rankings that you see here, color-coded from good to very poor, which is more of the reddish color, and also a number of firmographic information to enable filtering. And you can add tags and help organize into folders and so on. And an even more granular view would be an individual report here. And so here we're looking into an individual company. I think this is 3M over here, how they're comparing, what they're doing. You can see we have something called a data depth indicator. This is an indicator showing you the availability or robustness of data behind the ranking. This would include all types of data sources, including Dun & Bradstreet, Global Data Cloud, news, company reports, government information, legal information, certifications, NGO data, any other type of disclosure, and then any data submitted to us directly through our self-assessment. That would be an A, and then down to I would be our lowest level of data depth, which would just be qualitative information, potentially from reports or news. And speaking of the last data collection system, which is our self-assessment, this is a very similar structure as to many surveys or required data components out there where one can voluntarily submit information regarding ESG performance. You can upload documents, add different types of evidence, and so on. And so this is a great way to submit information, which then goes through a validation process where it is checked for outliers, correctly uploaded documentation, also any type of cross-check of what's available publicly before it's ingested into our data systems. So I believe that concludes my presentation around ESG and compliance, and an example of a solution that can help you have a lot of ESG data right away, as well as monitor and track that over time, and potentially integrate that into existing monitoring and tracking systems that you may be using for compliance, risk management, and so on. So with that, I think we'll be able to open up to questions, and I look forward to answering them.
Yes, and we have already some questions.